second event.
Well, hello everyone. We'll take a few more minutes to let others join the call, and then we'll start. Well, I think we can start. First of all, hello everyone, and welcome to the second event of our special online meetup series at Web3 Developers Underground community. Before we start the event, I would like to tell you a little bit about Web3 Devs Underground. So, first of all, we are a community of Web3 developers that was founded on the open source values. It was founded by Shauli Rejwan and Roy Yasherov, and since then, we have consistently organized physical events in Israel dedicated for the Web3 developers with some of the best and technical minds in the industry today. Recently, we have started a series of online events, and we're excited that you can be part of it. So, few words about our sponsors today. As you can see, Masterkey VC is an early stage venture capital. We specialize in infrastructure and deep tech in the Web3 ecosystem. Our team members are located around the globe on the big crypto hubs. Our team includes 16 world-class cryptographers and other technical experts, and is led by Shauli Rejwan, our managing partners. Without further ado, I'm giving the mic to Alon, the founder and CEO of SSV Labs. And Alon, the mic is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Can I share my presentation? Let's see. Is there a way to share?
Yeah, let me know it works.
Yeah, give me a sec.
Awesome, I can see it.
Can you guys see my screen well?
Yeah. And
all right, perfect.
Just to clarify, everyone, if you have any questions or anything that you want to ask during the call, you can ask it in the chat, and we will bring it up to Alon's attention. And Alon, you can start.
Awesome, thank you. So my name is Alon. I'm the CEO of SSV Labs, which is the core team behind SSV Network. We are the centralized infrastructure for Ethereum, doing a bunch of different things. We started life in the staking world, and we currently have just close to 120,000 Ethereum validators, roughly 4 million ETH at stake, 11% of the Ethereum stake in general. And we are very focused on the centralized infrastructure, providing developers that do staking various infrastructural components for their applications, from solo stakers, liquid staking protocols, and exchanges and institutions. And SSB is really kind of set to be an infrastructural component of Ethereum. We started with staking, though we are quickly evolving to the things we'll talk about today. But that's kind of SSV at a kind of super high level. I've been in the crypto space for quite a while. In Ethereum in specific, I've been actually in the early days of Ethereum. I worked on Ethereum J, the Java version of Ethereum, or Java client of Ethereum, and so I've been in the Ethereum ecosystem for quite a while. And it's clear to me that Ethereum has the tech supremacy on a lot of the other different blockchains. Its approach to decentralization and credible neutrality, I think it really what sets us apart and enables it to grow and attract so many developers. And so I think the tech supremacy side of Ethereum is quite interesting, and especially with the rollup-centric roadmap. What it enabled is not only to scale Ethereum, but if you think about it, rollups are a new business model. It's a business model where companies, projects, institutions can come and provide their flavor of Ethereum to their users, still enjoying the security and settlement of Ethereum itself. And it also, of course, enabled Ethereum to horizontally scale. The more rollups Ethereum has, the more TPS it can provide to its users, and the variety of different rollups is quite interesting. So in terms of tech supremacy, I think Ethereum is there, and also worth noting that Ethereum is also very willing to take technical risks. One of the, if you look back at the 9 or 11 different forks Ethereum did along its years, even the last ones, they are heavy and they are very technical, and some of them really use cutting edge technology. If you go back to even the Bitcoin chain launching just a few years ago, it uses cryptography, which is very much cutting edge. And now if you're even moving towards ZK snarking the entire blockchain. So that's really interesting. And so the tech side, I think, is super interesting, and it's something that Ethereum has dialed down to a really good degree. I think where the problem starts is that the roll-up centric roadmap for Ethereum not only provided a new business model and scale, but also created fragmentation and value capturing issues or challenges. Each roll-up is currently is its own economic zone, and obviously trying to get as many users and developers coming in on onboarding. But because they're their own economic zone, they are loosely coupled to Ethereum in a way that it should be to a much higher degree. Meaning that obviously they're using settlement for Ethereum. Most of them are using Ethereum as data availability, but ultimately their coupling to Ethereum, I think, is good now. But if we continue with this trend, I think that there will be less and less coupled to Ethereum for the very fact that users are using the L2 directly instead of the Ethereum blockchain. And so at some point, the bigger rollups potentially can just leave or eject out of Ethereum if we don't do something about it. And the reason primarily is because they're their own economic zone, and they only use really Ethereum for its economical security. At some point, you can actually replace economic security, and so that's really a challenge. Another kind of mirror image of that is value capturing. Ultimately, those rollups today process much more transactions than Ethereum, the L1 does. But in my opinion, not enough value is captured by Ethereum ETH holders, and that kind of brings us to, I think, the biggest challenge Ethereum has in the next few years, which is there is a divergence happening between Ethereum, the token, and Ethereum, the blockchain. A very dangerous divergence in a sense that Ethereum, the blockchain, is at its prime, but Ethereum, the token, is not. The graph you're seeing here is ETH versus Bitcoin the past, I think, couple of years. And it obviously shows a decline versus Bitcoin, even though if you look at the technology, if you look at its usage, Ethereum is clearly winning the blockchain war. And that divergence, in my assumption or my proposition, is that this divergence is extremely dangerous for Ethereum. And so that's the challenge, but we also can do something about it. It's not the end of the road. It's definitely something we can do and kind of fix. And I think it all stems down to a very simple question, which is why would the average Joe hold ETH? What is the main reason for you, me, others to go and buy Ethereum? It can't really be for gas because gas is not a major factor in expenditure when it comes to ETH holding. Gas is actually quite low or quite marginal in how much ETH do I really need to hold. And so what are the reasons why I would hold ETH? And I think in the past there were really good reasons to hold ETH. Back in 2017, the main reason to hold ETH was to buy into ICOs. And buying into ICOs was really the not only the feature of Ethereum back in the day, but also the main reason to hold ETH, because with ETH you went in and bought into those ICOs. And so holding Ethereum had a really good reason, driven by the feature set of Ethereum itself. Then came DeFi a few years later. And the main reason to hold ETH was to actually trade. So you could provide liquidity. A lot of the trading happened against ETH, especially if you're creating new tokens. And so the really good reason was, if you wanted to participate in DeFi, you needed to hold ETH in your wallet. And again, that was a really good reason to hold ETH. And my proposition today is that the next really big reason to hold ETH is ETH can secure much more than just itself. ETH can do much more than just staking on Ethereum. And that really unlocks a lot of different things. And it has to do with the value chain of Ethereum, from users all the way through rollups and Ethereum itself. I don't know if we have any questions. I see. Yeah. Okay. Um, and so that's kind of my proposition here. And it all starts with this concept called based and composable rollups. We all know what rollups are. Rollups are these chains that are settling and publishing data on Ethereum, but enabling to basically do off-chain computation for transactions. Basically, we separate between data and computation. Data is on Ethereum. Computation is on this new type of thing called a rollup. Based and composable rollups change two main things and they're really unlocking kind of the next gen rollups, in my opinion, which are sequenced by Ethereum validators and not centralized entities. And they are offering under 100 millisecond transaction confirmation at a scale that is vastly bigger than any of its competitors today. And so that's what base and composable rollups unlock. But they also solve a major challenge, or a major issue, which is why would the average Joe hold ETH? If we go back to kind of the history of rollups, most of them developed as a centralized sequenced rollup, meaning there's a centralized entity that sequences or builds all of the blocks on those rollups. And the reason why, because one, it was simple, but two, that's in the core of how the business model around rollups is made. So if you look at the biggest rollups today, like Coinbase and OpenAI's rollup and Sony's rollup and Uniswap's rollup, all of them have a centralized sequencer that builds the block, and the centralized sequencer is owned by a company, and that company is making profit out of all of the fees generated by that sequencer. And so there's a major incentive to have a centralized sequencer. The problem with that is that once you do that, the rollup itself becomes owned by that company. And that kind of goes against what Ethereum tries to do, which is be incredibly neutral as a value proposition in a way that makes a lot of developers want to use it. And so based rollups are the idea that we can, instead of having a centralized sequencer, actually enable Ethereum validators to be the sequencers of rollups, meaning Ethereum validators opt in and can start sequencing different rollups. The reason why you want to do that is, one, to enjoy the properties of Ethereum validators, things like censorship resistance and liveness, but also it drives a lot of value back to validators, because if all of a sudden Ethereum validators are the ones sequencing, then they can draw value from fees generated in those blocks. The cool thing about it is, if you make Ethereum validators also become sequencers, you open the door for something called synchronous composability, which is the idea that multiple independent rollups can transact between them in a synchronous and composable way, meaning within one transaction, one atomic transaction, you can interact and send transactions between multiple rollup in an atomic way, in an atomic way, meaning that either all of the transactions happen or none of them, which is a very important property. In a synchronous way, meaning that it happens in one go. And in a composable way, meaning you can compose different or interact with different contracts and addresses on different rollups. And so that's also what's being enabled by things like based sequencing, because of the fact that we have a common layer that sequences multiple different rollups. And so based rollups are one of those elements. There's a question, what are the incentives for a rollup to become based? Well, I think that for existing rollups, it's kind of like saying, what is the incentive for a centralized exchange to become decentralized? And I think the obvious answer is there isn't any. Centralized sequenced rollups will remain centralized sequenced. Actually, the value of from the get-go becoming a based rollup is the fact that as a based rollup, you can do synchronous composability with other rollups. and that creates a major network effect. Instead of having one rollup, one economic zone, all of a sudden you have a network of rollups that can interact between them. And so the value from the network effect is much greater than a single rollup. And we'll talk about it in a second. And so those are kind of the base rollups is starting with base sequencing, really. Another point, which is kind of built on top of that, is called pre-confirmations. The idea with pre-confirmations is to establish or enable cryptoeconomic guarantees for a transaction inclusion or execution within a block before even the block is published. And so today on Ethereum, you have 12-second blocks. On average, rollups have around 2-second blocks. Solana has, I think, 400 millisecond blocks. What I'm saying is that with pre-confirmations, without changing anything to the core of Ethereum, we can enable or unlock sub 100 millisecond transaction confirmation on Ethereum and Ethereum rollups. And that's kind of being unlocked by, again, Ethereum validators and Ethereum sequencers by providing crypto economic guarantees. Essentially, validators can opt in to provide pre-confirmation, and if they lie or cheat or try to be malicious, they actually can get slashed. Again, this is completely out of the core of Ethereum, but it's kind of like MEV. It's a service that validators can opt into. And it's an amazing service because it enables ultimately to unlock super, super fast transaction confirmation. And that's really, really kind of another layer to this base and composable rollups we're talking about, even though pre-confirmations can potentially work on existing rollups as well. And then we're coming to, I think, one of the biggest highlights of base and composable rollup, which is the composability itself. With synchronous composability, we can enable L1 to L2 and L2 to L2 within a single transaction composability between multiple rollups and Ethereum itself. So think about the next example. Think of being able to, in one transaction, deposit to a rollup, trade on that rollup, but basically exchange that asset, move that asset to another rollup, take a loan using that asset, and then withdrawing whatever the loan you got back to the L1, all in one transaction, which is atomic and synchronous. That is really powerful because what it means essentially that we can consolidate or really fix the fragmentation that happened with rollups to a point where all of the different rollups and Ethereum itself is like one huge chain. And everything in it is completely seamless from the user experience. And that's really a big, big factor. And it depends on those rollups having what is known as a shared sequencer, meaning one sequencer that actually sequences or build blocks for multiple rollups at a time. If we have that, we can actually, because it's a shared sequencer, we can enable that shared sequencer to create those links between those rollups. And that's really, I think, one of the major improvements we'll see for rollups in the next couple of years. The idea that those rollups, one, become based, offering pre-confirmations which enable 100 millisecond transaction confirmation, plus the idea that they can be completely composable with other rollups. This is really the future of rollups today in Ethereum. Now, if you compare that to things like Solana, Sway, and other blockchains which say they offer super fast, super capable blockchains, we can do that, but still maintain decentralization, credibility, neutrality, and censorship resistant, the way Ethereum has been doing it for the past decade. And I think that's the kind of the major news here. We can fix not only Ethereum's rollup challenges, but we can also enable it to be super aligned with Ethereum, and we can create this Ethereum value engine back to ETH holders. Because if Ethereum validators are the ones sequencing and doing composability, they will be the ones collecting fees, and those fees ultimately get back to Ethereum validators. And so going back to the question, why would the average Joe hold Ethereum? The answer, I think, is because you can take a piece out of the biggest, most widely used blockchain in the world, in a way that is unprecedented and unparalleled in any other blockchain. And I'll give an example. Let's say somebody launches an Ethereum rollup, which is super successful, and that Ethereum rollup is based and takes, let's say, 10% out of all of the transaction volume of rollups. All of a sudden, all of the validators that sequence that are participating in taking, in effect, taking rewards from 10% of Ethereum. There is no other blockchain that enables you as a validator to earn 10% of the fees of whatever blockchain you can reference. The only way in other blockchains to get 10% of the blockchain is to actually buy 10% of all of the tokens of that blockchain, which obviously will, skyrocket the price, and it's very hard to do. But on Ethereum, all of a sudden, this thing is developed where the validators themselves are this vessel to create value extraction from massive adoption of Ethereum back to the ETH holder and back to the validator. And so, kind of as a summary, if you historically looked at Ethereum as this settlement and data availability layer, there's a new feature emerging from Ethereum, which is sequencing as a service. Ethereum will be also sequencing Ethereum rollups together with providing data availability and settlement. And that will drive value back to ETH holders from probably the greatest developer ecosystem ever lived in a public good or an open source community. So if you want to learn more and kind of join us in our journey in developing that, feel free to reach out. And I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I would love to answer any of them. If anyone has any questions, we'll be happy to answer. Or all right, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Alon. We'll wait a few more minutes here in the call to see if there are more smart or just any other questions. And yeah, thank you so much, Alon.
So I'm reading a question. What are the milestones and changes required to the main chain to make this vision happen? So actually, there's a few things that the Ethereum main L1 can do, but in kind of a high level, there isn't really anything the Ethereum L1 needs to do. All of the pieces are there. So um, there is actively around 10 teams working on various components of what I've mentioned here. Most of that effort from the Ethereum Foundation side is led by Justin Drake. Um, and so there's a lot of research and development happening throughout the past year and a half to make this thing a reality. My bet is that at the beginning of next year, we'll start seeing based and composable rollups coming into testnet and then mainnet. are we not? Are we gonna hit the same bandwidth limitations to the base layer? So um, currently, Ethereum is supporting 6 blobs per slot. The plans are to actually increase that to 96 blobs in the next 2 years. And so we'll see quite significant increment in the blob or data availability capacity of Ethereum to a degree I think that will support, I think, around 10 or 20,000 TPS. So on that front, I think that's going to be increasing with the market. In parallel, Ethereum is also planning to increase quite significantly the gas limits on Ethereum itself. So the next milestone will be doubling the Ethereum gas limit from 30 or 35 to 60, and then continuing with that probably in the next few years towards maybe 3 to 500 million gas. When looking at other chains like Solana and others, what are the major reasons you think ETH is better? I think ETH is better for a number of reasons. One is Ethereum really does focus a lot on Ethereum being incredibly neutral, censorship resistant, and also very innovative in its approaches. I don't know if you noticed, but you know, along all of the different uh, claims that Ethereum went wrong with the Ethereum rollup roadmap, a lot of the other projects are actually copying the rollup centric roadmap. I think that Ethereum being a tech leader and making sure that the chain itself remains as credibly neutral as possible really makes developers come in and use it. The reason why is that really institutions from TradFi and others, when they are going to choose a chain, they don't want to choose a chain which is owned by somebody. They want a neutral chain, and so I think that's a major part of that. And I think that's what makes really Ethereum better. The tech decisions and the hard focus on decentralization, credibly neutral, censorship resistant approaches. Why new projects should build on Ethereum? Um, New projects should build on Ethereum for the very fact, the same reason as I mentioned before. It's not to say that there is no opportunities in other chains, but if you want the exposure to the biggest audience in the world, if you want exposure to the best brains in the world, the best developer ecosystem in the world, and ultimately the place where most of the non-crypto projects, companies, and entities come in, you should build on Ethereum. Again, that's not to say that there are no use cases that leverage things like Solana, but I think overall, what you'll see is the consolidation of the vast majority of applications going on Ethereum or Ethereum rollups, which already happens today, but I think at a greater degree going forward. Um, Next, the ETH Foundation supported the current roadmap. Not sure I understood the question. Is it supporting the base and composable rollup roadmap? If so, definitely it's led by the Ethereum Foundation. A lot of the heads of the Ethereum Foundation talking about it quite a lot. And it's something that is, I think, at the core of what Ethereum is trying to do alongside obviously scale Ethereum itself. Which steps need to take so ETH will keep growing in value? I think one of the major components is exactly what I've talked about. Answer a really simple question. Why would the average Joe hold ETH? I think it goes back to the narrative. Bitcoin has a very simple narrative, even though it's, I think, completely bogus. The 21 million cap narrative. Um, and that's a really good narrative because it resonates with TradFi and Wall Street. And I think Ethereum should adopt the narrative of value capturing because it by far has the biggest developer ecosystem and by far has the most to offer in that regard. If we can get the narrative better and focus on value capturing, I think that will follow. If you can elaborate a bit about how interop or inter rollup communication should work in this model, like how is the multi-ledger state consistency achieved? So one of the components to make cross transactions between rollups is the idea that you have some common sequencer that controls the block building for multiple rollups for a specific time frame. If you do have that, that sequencer can now do cross transactions. And the way they do that is kind of like accounting. So if you have one transaction going to another rollup, it needs to be marked somehow on the source and target rollups. Afterwards, after all of the blocks were processed, you simply add a few conditions or a few validation rules to the rollup, making sure that both of the blocks of both of the rollups include the source and target transactions, and that's how the cross chain communication happens. Another option, which is a bit more difficult, is actually to go through the L1, but that requires um, in some cases, it requires the L1 proposer to also be the shared sequencer. And so it's all about the validity or the atomicity of the transactions. If you can prove that the source and target transactions are both included in both blocks at the same time, you can do the cross transactions. What are the architectural trade-offs of this solution? The architectural trade-offs are latency. If it takes more latency to do cross transactions between rollups. The problem with not doing that is there isn't no other real way to scale up to the size Ethereum wants other than horizontal scaling. All of the other solutions of making a really, really big blockchain come with a great cost of centralization. Ethereum doesn't want to do that. And so the only good alternative is horizontal scaling with rollups. And with horizontal scaling, you need to solve the composability between them. Now, the question is not necessarily what is the trade-off, but rather how much out of the entire transaction volume, how many transactions will be cross-chain, and how efficient can you make it? I think you can actually make it quite efficient. I think you within the block, especially with pre-confirmations, if you have a block which is actually even longer than we have today, but you add pre-confirmations, you can still have very fast transaction confirmation alongside the enough time to do cross transactions and validation. And so I definitely think it's doable, and I think with even current architecture, you can definitely have super high speed cross transaction, even if it's a bit more latency than obviously one state. Um, do we need so many L2s? So it depends on how you look at it. From scaling point of view, you don't maybe need that many, but because it's its own business model, I think that it makes a lot of sense to have as many L2s. It's kind of like asking, do we have too many tokens, right? You know, if you're cynical, you might say yes, but ultimately that's one of the more interesting business models in the industry. I do think that many L2s are have diminishing returns because if you don't have composability, what happens is that most of the transactions go to the top 5 or 10 rollups. But I am very much in favor of a future where I don't know if tens of thousands of rollups, but thousands of rollups is something that will happen, and it also gives way to customizability by the developers of different applications. What should junior developers learn or start with to get into the field? That's very depending on what you want to do. Do you want to be a Solidity developer? Do you want to be an infra developer or a core developer? Do you want to be a networking developer? Like, depends on what you want to do. The easiest thing is obviously to just jump into Solidity and learn the basics. Solidity is quite simple, and there's a lot written about it and a lot of different libraries and frameworks around it. So yeah, just jump into Solidity, I guess. Another question. You've emphasized the importance of institutional adoption. What specific features, compliance certificates, certifications, and services level agreements, SLAs, do you believe will define the gold standard for enterprise grade DVT solutions? And what is SSV Labs' timeline for achieving this? So, actually, SSV Labs is an infrastructure provider. We actually try not to do those things. What we did along the past 2 years was to actually partner up with a lot of various staking providers which offer those types of things. SOC2, SLAs, they are really the face of SSV if you think about it. We try really hard to maintain, to really focus on the architecture and really building the best our infrastructure we can. That's what really enabled us to grow so fast. I actually don't know of any other protocol that maybe other than Eigenlayer that grew to 4 million ETH in such a short time. Um, and so that's really our focus. We hardly focus on service provision. We're actually much more focusing on the infrastructure side. Could this infrastructure eventually support use cases entirely outside of staking and restaking paradigm? Definitely, it can. Um, but I think that, and we are thinking about it all the time. One of those things is what I've talked today about, which is the idea of extending what a validator can do to the world of pre-confirmations and base sequencing is entirely out of the staking and restaking paradigm, but it's within Ethereum. And so by extending that, I think one, DVT will play a major role, and two, it's in the same kind of ecosystem. If you think about it, we're building a base and composable rollup stack. If you look at then kind of and figure out what SSV is, you'll see that SSV provides infrastructure for stakers, for staking providers, for LSTs and LRTs. Then it provides infrastructure for rollup developers, dApp developers, and users of those dApps. And so it's an entire value chain within one project for the entirety of the thing that Ethereum does. And so we are seeing SSV and DVT becoming more than just staking and restaking. Um, Are there new applications or user experiences that would be enabled by the new vision, or is it purely around bringing value back to main chain? I think that, so there's a few things here. One is, I think speed and scale in of themselves unlock many use cases which are currently limited. If you can 10x, 100x, 1000x the capacity of Ethereum while still having composability, in of itself, that opens up a lot of doors, I think. That's one. Number two is, I think the roll-up business model is really interesting. And there's a specific example I gave, which I think will unlock in the next couple of years, probably the biggest adoption crypto ever had. Think of the four biggest banks in the US or Europe, right? uh, what is their path to go into crypto if they believe crypto is really big? They started with custodianship because they're used to doing that, right? Custodianship basically meaning they're willing to accept either your crypto or crypto related fiat, right? That's level one. Level two is stablecoins. We are seeing stablecoins explode, and I definitely think we'll see bank-related stablecoins coming into play. So that's kind of they're dipping their toes as dApp developers. So they're going from being wallet providers to being dApp developers. The next phase of that will be, in my opinion, that a few of the big banks in Europe or the US will actually launch their own composable rollups with maybe KYC and AML like they're used to in their traditional industry. That will be the third wave of what they're doing, and they will in fact become the very rails that they today are built on. And so think of major banks launching rollups on Ethereum. That will open up the doors for basically meaning that Ethereum is becoming the vast kind of financial ecosystem or banking ecosystem of the world. And I think it's very much going to happen in the next few years. And so the roll up business model in of itself opens up use cases, I think, that we didn't think about before. And so that's going to be super interesting. Um, Another question is not in a direct context to the lecture, but if you can pinpoint the benefits from your view in the recent Pectra upgrade and its effect on the SSV network. Yeah, there's a bunch of really interesting things happened on the Pectra upgrade. Specifically for staking, Pectra introduced the idea that validators can actually have 64x the amount of effective balance for staking, meaning that you can have up until now or up until Pectra, you could have at a maximum a validator effective balance or the balance with which it does staking uh, be 32 ETH. Today, validators can actually do 2048 ETH, which is 64x bigger. Another thing you can do is consolidate validators. Basically, you can take 64 validators, squash them into one, and you'll get exactly the same returns and rewards as you did before. That's a major thing for staking because, in my opinion, long term, that will reduce by around 50% the cost of doing staking and increase quite significantly the net profit from staking as a result. Also, that will make the Beacon chain much lighter than what it is today and open up the doors for things like single slot finality, meaning that Ethereum will finalize in one slot, in one 12-second slot instead of 64 slots like it is today. And so those are the major upgrades for staking. There's a bunch of other upgrades, some of which, for example, is the idea that you can verify BLS 1238.1 on chain, which opens up the door for a bunch of different things alongside, for example, ZK proofs. Another point is account abstraction. You can now have EOA addresses act as smart contracts. So Pectra was a major, major upgrade in of its own. Yeah. And it also bumped up the blobs from 3 blobs a slot to 6 blobs a slot. All right. Thank you, everyone. It was a blast, and thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, Alon. Yeah, and thank you everyone for attending. We'll upload this later.